So we are going to get a little technical, and I think to properly convey sort of the importance of why we isolate plants and some of the techniques that are important when you're saving seed, it's useful to share some terminology and I guess some concepts. Saving seed is something that anyone can do. It's a really important part of the cycle of growing food. Is that concept that when I think about talking to people, you think about seeds and where do you think seeds come from? You think about the seed packet, you might get it at a hardware store or a company, a seed saving company. But then I think a lot of people, especially last year when there was a major uptick interest in growing your own food and some questions about our food system being a little bit more fragile than previous years, seed saving companies were overwhelmed. A lot of seeds were out of stock, and that has continued into this year. And so I know there has been a lot of newfound interest in seed saving, and I think it's an incredibly important thing to learn more about and see if you want to embark upon it. And that's especially true for heirloom crops and maintaining the diversity of crops that is dwindling with each year. So you can definitely save seed from plants. Relatively easily. I think someone mentioned saving flower seeds. That's a great place to start. And you will often save a seed, and if you plant it next season, you'll get something pretty much resembling what you grew last year. But sometimes you'll find that you saved the seed from some plant. Maybe a squash is often a good example. And when you plant it the next year, it looks completely different than the plant it grew out of. And so we're going to offer a little bit of information about why that might happen and help you be a little bit more knowledgeable when you're proceeding. So there are two sort of main subsets of seeds and the way that they function in terms of basically what their genetic makeup is and how that's going to impact how they grow or how their progeny, how their next generation grow. So open pollinated plants are plants that can be externally pollinated, but it's sort of misleading, but the most important aspect to know about open pollinated plants is that they have the capacity to grow true to type. So basically, they have been inbred enough over the course of several generations, that they have a very consistent genetic material, and they are going to have the capacity to grow true to type. Hybrid plants. So hybrid plants you might be familiar with. A lot of the seeds that we end up growing are hybrid plants. Especially, I think this is especially true in a more production farming setting, they have been crossed. So not just GMO plants have mixed genetic information. Hybrid plants are essentially, there was a process that two different kinds of plant lines were crossed, or multiple plant lines were crossed, to basically bring out some characteristic that makes them stronger or more resilient. So often you'll hear of hybrid plants. Someone will say, "Oh, my plants suffer so much from downy mildew," and someone will recommend, "Oh, get this kind of seed. It's resistant to downy mildew. It's a hybrid that's resistant to downy mildew," or something like that. So those have been bred, and I'm going to show some pictures later. But basically, they will produce a generation. So when the two plants are bred, the seeds that you're getting in that seed packet, or from some farmer or something like that, are going to produce uniform plants that have a certain characteristic, for instance, pest resistance. But the next generation of plants, the next generation of seeds, so if you save seed from the hybrid tomato that you grew, you will not be guaranteed that it will grow true to type. And true to type, as I said before, is seeds that produce plants with similar characteristics to the parent plant. So we're going to get into this a little bit more, because sometimes the concept of open pollinated, the words can be a little confusing. I think it's useful to look at a diagram. So here's sort of the concept of a hybrid plant. You might have a small corn, but it's you know, that's really sweet and yellow, but it's not as disease resistant. Then you have this larger corn that's not as sweet and yellow, but it is disease resistant. And those will be crossed to have this sort of best of both worlds corn. And so you'll have your inbred. I was saying that idea of an open pollinated plant is repeatedly inbred. And so it has a very consistent genetic, like AA, BB, for instance, and you're then crossing those two together to get AB. So it's a mix. But they all are going to be AB. They're going to be consistent in the F1 generation. However, so here it is again, two different kinds of plants crossed. You have this nice hybrid plant, but when you save seed the next generation, you're going to get all sorts of characteristics that you didn't expect. So you might have, you know, some characteristics that weren't even true in the parent lines because it brings out all of this genetic information. So for example, you crossed a P and a W, the first generation is going to be, you know, so the first generation is a PW, you'll have one that's PP, one that's BPW, one that's WW. So you really could have, in this situation, you're going to have 3 different ways that the plant could turn out. And only some of which will be the same, but not necessarily. So I can take a pause if anyone has questions about that. I think this diagram is probably the most helpful in thinking about why hybrid plants, you might want to hesitate to save seed from them. So imagine you're getting the seed in this generation, and then when you plant those seeds, the next generation, they're going to look like this, which, you know, is not necessarily the bad thing. I often say, like for tomatoes, for instance, they might not look exactly like their parent, but you'll get a tomato 9 times out of 10 that's fine, you know. And so it's not saying that you can't necessarily save the seed. Also, you can't necessarily save hybrid seed. It just means that it won't be, if you're really excited about a particular variety, it won't be the exact same variety. Are there any questions about that?
I would like to point out that the chat is not showing any chats, or whether it's open or what. I know you had said you had put something there.
Let me see.
I know if you were asking for questions, people maybe can't ask.
It should be. Are other people finding that they have the ability to add to the chat?
It's totally blank to me, so. Oh,
I
people
think
are saying they can chat. Okay, it's good. But you had said you had put something there, I thought,
right,
and nothing was showing. So
got
thank
it.
you.
I'll resend that. I think also that might have just been sent to Ali. Thank you. So here's some links for your reference. Do you see that now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm going to move on then. So then comparing the hybrid plant to an heirloom plant. So it's sort of like a square rectangle thing. All heirlooms are open pollinated, but not all open pollinated are heirlooms. So you have to be an open pollinated plant, meaning you have the ability to grow true to type. You're not a hybrid. But heirloom is specifically defined as a plant that's been passed down for at least 3 generations of human people. So that's a pretty long time. That's many plant generations. So, you know, that's decades of plant generations. And so they're, you know, very inbred, very true to type. They have the potential of growing pretty true to type. They, you know, they would have the sort of AA genetic information. And so if you play your cards right and you save the seed of an heirloom tomato, you'll be able to grow a tomato very consistently that has the same characteristics.
Annabelle, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I don't know if you know that you're not sharing the screen anymore.
I can't quite hear you. You're very muted.
Your screen share stopped. I don't know if you
My screen share stopped. Thank you. All right. Okay. So heirloom plants, as I was saying, have the potential to grow true to type. So heirloom plants defined as having been passed down for at least 3 generations of people. These are the kind of seeds that really have a story behind them. If you think about 3 generations of humans, that means that someone really loved this variety so much that they were so dedicated to making sure that they passed it down. And so, not only, and so I think you've heard of heirloom tomatoes. Here's a picture of heirloom tomatoes. They often, look a little bit more unusual, have different coloration or different shapes. They're a little bit more interesting than those sort of standard red tomatoes you see. And there's a wider diversity of them. There's a lot of different varieties, and it is hard to maintain all of them. And I think that's why a lot of people talk about heirloom plants as being at risk of being lost. And they not only, and we'll get, and Allie will get more into this later, but they not only carry a diversity of variety, but they carry these stories of the people. So that's something that is important beyond just the idea that you're maintaining diversity of varieties. Beyond this idea of hybrids and open pollinated plants, there are different ways that plants get pollinated, even if so it's a little counterintuitive, but some open pollinated plants, they have the capacity to be pollinated externally, but they have the ability to self-pollinate. So plants that have perfect flowers. So that means that they have both sets of reproductive parts, so they can provide the pollen, and that can go into the ovary and make seeds without any other flowers. So it actually doesn't even need a bee or an external pollinating agent to pollinate. And a classic example of this is legumes like peas. And so they typically self-pollinate. And so that's a reason you can have many varieties of peas and beans together, and they tend to not cross-pollinate. Nightshades also have perfect flowers, so they can self-pollinate, but this doesn't mean they necessarily do. They actually will often do better if there's some external pollination. But it does mean that if you just left it on its own, it could produce a fruit. Whereas imperfect flowers, so a plant will have the different reproductive parts in different places. So corn is a good example. I think I might have a picture of corn. Did I put it in here? Yeah, so I'll get there. But corn, you might recognize this tassel that's at the top of the corn, and that's offering the pollen. And then, your ear of corn will have that silk coming out of it. Even if you haven't grown corn, if you get an ear of corn with a husk still on it, you'll see that silk, and those actually receive the pollen and bring it into the fruit, which each grain of corn is a seed. So that's an example of an imperfect flower. They're separate. And then squash is another example of imperfect flowers. So if anyone's grown squash, you'll see the quote unquote male flower and the quote unquote female. So the main difference is noticeable when the fruit starts being produced, because they'll be produced on only some of the flowers in the plant. And the flowers, when they are growing, actually do look a little different. So you can see the inside of this flower does look different. And so even before the fruit starts being produced, you can distinguish this, and that can be relevant if you're hand pollinating. So here's a comparison, perfect versus imperfect. You can see the stigma and the anthers everything is on this one flower. And here there are two different kinds of flowers that have different parts. So like this. And that's all relevant when it comes to pollination, because basically imperfect flowers are not going to be able to pollinate unless wind or bees or some external force pollinates them. And then that brings in, and we'll get to that later, that brings in more potential for cross-pollination. So the last terminology, I know this is dense, and we'll get to the more fun stuff in a minute, but the last terminology that's useful to think about is whether plants are monoecious or dioecious. And those are big words, but essentially just mean whether or not they have, all the reproductive parts on one plant, or whether you need multiple plants for them to pollinate. So basically, corn, cucumbers, squash, they have, separate flowers with reproductive parts, but um, they are all on the same plant. So you could grow one squash plant and end up having squash. But asparagus and spinach, for instance, actually the reproductive parts are on different plants. So what that means essentially is you couldn't produce spinach seeds unless you had more than one spinach plant, and that you made sure you had spinach plants with each kind of reproductive part. So that's relevant. Most plants are monoecious that we grow. A lot of the squash, the nightshades, all of that, but it is important to consider. Asparagus is interesting because it's a bigger plant. You would maybe consider just growing one. So it's definitely more relevant for fruit trees, whether or not you need multiple fruit trees, because that's something you would maybe just plant one of. But if it's dioecious, then you are going to need to grow more than one fruit tree to produce fruit to be pollinated. So the self-pollinating plants, this sort of goes back to the perfect flowers. They usually produce seed that'll be identical to the parent. And that means you're not as worried about cross-pollination. So beans and legumes, I think, are the classic example of this. You can grow many varieties at a time, and you don't have to be worried about cross-pollination. So you could have green beans and speckled beans, and you could have them relatively close to each other, and there'd be a very little risk that your beans wouldn't grow true to type, and definitely true of peas. Whereas plants that are prone to cross-pollinating, even if they're heirloom and they're very, inbred genetically consistent, they have the potential to get cross-pollinated. So this is important, and this is where we're going to get into the more practical component. This is when you have to think about isolation, because certain plants have the ability to cross-pollinate with each other, and that's going to impact what, the genetic information of their seeds and whether or not they're going to grow true to type. So the answer to that is isolation. So that's going to be pretty typical, is that most of the seeds that you're saving are open pollinated varieties, not hybrids, that have the ability to cross-pollinate. Very few plants are self-pollinating. And so you have to think about isolation. And so that's, I think, the major takeaway of all of that, is why when you're saving a lot of varieties of plants, you have to take into consideration what other plants you're growing in your garden, what maybe, depending on the plant, what your neighbor's growing half a mile away might impact it, because, bees travel, wind travels, and so there is a risk of cross-pollination. So typically the rule of thumb, and I found a great website, I think I included it, plants with the same scientific name are the same species and can be crossbred. Sometimes this is not just with, different varieties of plants that you would grow. It could be a wild plant. So a classic example is carrots and Queen Anne's lace can cross-pollinate because they are technically the same species. But I kind of want to try opening this, see if it works. This is pretty simplistic, but this is a good idea of what you might want to consider would cross-pollinate. So a classic one is any brassica, which is sort of the cabbage family: cauliflower, cabbage, kale, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, broccoli, collard green, just that list goes on. This is if you've ever talked about plant varieties, you'll find out that those plants are actually all siblings. They're essentially the same species that's just been bred to have slightly different characteristics. So any plant in that family can cross-pollinate. And so if you're trying to save Brussels sprout seeds, unfortunately, that means you have to isolate your Brussels sprout from cabbage, kale, kohlrabi. Otherwise, you might get a weird cross of Brussels sprouts and kohlrabi, which might be interesting, but it won't necessarily be what you're expecting. So beets will cross with Swiss chard, for instance. The Queen Anne's lace example. This is a little simplistic, but hot peppers and sweet peppers will cross-pollinate. But then one thing that, I learned recently is that tomatillos and tomatoes won't cross-pollinate, and watermelon will not cross-pollinate with, for example, cantaloupe. So, it's good to look into it. Also, sometimes you don't want to, over trouble yourself about it. I just need to go back now. Oops. How are people doing? Is there any questions? So yeah, I can actually share the link to the table. Really quickly in the chat. Make sure that when you're sending information in the chat, you're sending it to everyone, because I can't see the chat so well when I'm presenting, just so you know. Like, or send it to Allie, but it's better to just send it to everyone, and then we'll definitely see it. So just to reiterate, self-pollinating peas, of these classic varieties that we often grow, peas, beans, and also lettuce, typically self-pollinate. So you don't have to be super concerned about isolation. These plants can self-pollinate, but they can also cross-pollinate. So usually there's a small distance that you want to put. So I think I've heard 10 to 50 feet for eggplants, peppers, and tomatoes, the nightshade family. And then this set of plants, you definitely want a distance. So beets, brassicas, corn, cucurbits, spinach. Two that stand out to me are corn, is often pollinated by the wind. And so people who grow corn typically make really significant distance between varieties. So if you're trying to grow corn, it's pretty safe to say that you are only growing one variety of corn, unless you have multiple acres of land that you're growing on. So not necessarily urban gardening. And then, yeah, melons are another one that they say half a mile of distance. So it's just something to consider. So there is different ways to isolate. So so it doesn't just have to be physical distance. I mean, I was just talking about half a mile or something like that. You can distance with physical barriers. So here's some pictures. This is a technique that a lot of smaller scale gardeners will use to ensure that they're saving their heirloom seeds true to type. So you cover your crop when it's starting to flower. This will limit the capacity for external pollination, and you might have to hand pollinate. So that's often a relatively easy thing to do for tomatoes or for squash, for instance. And then you basically are controlling the situation a little bit versus hoping that it's not getting carried by the wind or a bee or another pollinator. And then time is another factor. So if you sort of stagger your, it's a little hard. We have a pretty short growing season in Boston, maybe where Allie is in Costa Rica, they have more capacity to do something like this. But if you plant, and I'm thinking about, plants that have a shorter life cycle. So cilantro it has capacity to cross-pollinate, but, has a really short life cycle. So you could just time it so that it's not flowering or being pollinated at the same time as a potential plant variety that will cross-pollinate with it. Yeah, so then we get into the fun part of actually saving the seed. So most
Annabelle, sorry, can I bring
Go
a
ahead,
question
yeah.
to your attention? So Amy is asking, I grew kale and collards next to each other and they wintered over and made seeds the following year, which I saved. What might I get if I plant them this year?
So you were a little muffled. Could you just say that one more time?
I'm not sure what's wrong with my audio. You might do better to just look in the chat if you
Great,
can't hear
yeah.
me now. Sorry.
Kale and collards next to each other and they wintered over. That's a great question, Amy. So you might end up getting, I mean, it's like, the thing about it is that, you know, this is information. If you're growing an heirloom kale plant and you really want to preserve that variety, then you wouldn't want to grow kale and collards next to each other. But if you're sort of open to what might happen, it might be kind of fun to plant that and see what it's like. It might look more like a kale plant. It might look more like a collard plant. It might have some characteristics of both. It might be that they didn't cross-pollinate. Yeah, Michelle, we're all set. Thank you. So, you know, honestly, I think it would be really, I think sometimes it's fun to see what happens. It is true that sometimes like some recessive gene comes up and it's really bizarre, but usually they're pretty standard looking. I mean, I haven't done that. I mean, I don't know if anyone has some good stories around that. My main experience with cross-pollinated or hybrid, you know, the second generation of hybrid plants is finding seeds that grow in the compost bin. And I feel like everyone has that story of like their mutant squashed in the compost bin. And like it doesn't look like an exact cross between two different squash plants. It's just its own thing entirely. But I think yeah, it would be interesting. Maybe Allie has some insight to that too. I think this is like pretty much the last, yeah, okay, well, I'll get through. But basically, a lot of seeds, you're saving them by just allowing them to dry on the plant. So a good example, I think good examples of, and this is usually pretty good for intro to seed saving, flower seeds or herb seeds like dill or cilantro or fennel. They will go to seed, I mean flowers, by making a flower, and then they start to dry out and you start to often see seeds or seed pods. And I think there's a sort of perfect window of time just as they're starting to dry out, which means the plant is fully mature because you don't want to take them before they're fully mature. But I also find I don't want to, I know this says make sure it's completely dry. But I think I like to harvest those kinds of plants like right before they're completely dry because it makes taking the seeds off a little easier. There's less chaff. So when it's completely dry, the chaff is also completely dry and it can make it easy for everything to get mixed together, which is an inevitable thing about saving seed. And so there are a lot of techniques and a lot of very traditional techniques that are used to separate chaff, which is just like the covering of the seed pod or the stalks that were still attached to the seed from the seed itself. So here are some pictures, and I did want to throw it over to Allie because she's been doing a lot of interesting, techniques around seed saving while we've been sitting here in the winter. So winnowing is here. I think there might be some zoomed in pictures. Basically, you're flipping it on a sort of wide bowl. So you can do this with a bowl you have at home. It's really challenging not to drop all of your seed, but the premise is chaff is lighter or less dense than the seed, and so it's going to blow away, whereas the seed will land back down. Screens can be really useful. And then rolling, I don't know, Allie, if you want to talk a little bit about this is a picture you took or you sourced.
Yeah. So this is how we separate the rice from the stalk. So the seed pods are the kind of darker brown end points of those longer stalks. And so we put a tarp down on the ground and then kind of whack them against that wooden slanted set of boards to separate the seeds down into away from the stalks. And then we're able to peel back the shell and save the rice seed or use it to cook.
Thanks, Allie. Yeah, that's really great that you had that actual experience. I've never grown rice, but I have watched some videos of it, and yeah, I mean, it's good. It's good to just think about also just different plants where our food comes, things that we eat all the time, and how we get those isolated from the rest of the plant. So that's dry processing. Wet processing is typically for seeds that you find in fruits. Cucumbers, squash, tomatoes, and um, and so typically something. Well, I think I'll talk about this right after. But you want that fruit, so it's a little different than if you're just harvesting the fruit to eat. It's more or less the same, but you want that fruit to fully mature on the plant to the point that it's almost about to rot. Because if you think about simulating the idea of saving seed as if the plant wants, the plant is creating a fruit and the fruit's going to fall to the ground, that fruit is going to rot, and the seeds will have the nutrients from the fruit to grow the following season or a couple of months later. And so often actually letting it almost rot is a great way of getting the seed ready to plant the following season. But you definitely at least want it to be fully mature on the plant. Like, sometimes we harvest tomatoes when they're a little green. If you're saving seed of tomato, you definitely want it to be like nice and soft. So wet processing is sort of based on the idea that healthy seeds are denser. So that's actually something you can do even if you buy seeds. Sometimes, usually seed companies should be reputable and like giving you healthy seed, but you might notice that some of your seed is more or less dense than others. And generally the denser seeds have the more, fuel inside of them to grow a healthy life. And so lighter seeds, and this is definitely true if you're saving seed, not all seed will be super viable, but you put the seed in a jar of water, the healthy seeds will be denser and sink, and the lighter seeds, as well as some of the debris of the plant, will float. And so you can skim off the unhealthy seeds and material and rinse your healthy seeds, and then make sure you dry them. You really want to make sure you dry them after that. So going back to that fermentation idea, tomatoes, cucumbers, squashes, like I was saying, benefit from some level of rotting or fermenting. It's sort of the same thing. And you are gonna, so sometimes you actually want to simulate that. This is especially true of tomatoes. They benefit from fermenting more explicitly than just, like having a slightly overripe fruit. So you remove the seeds, you might use some of the juice of the tomato and then put it at room temperature, and you essentially let it grow mold. And then once it grows mold, it's fermented to some degree, and you can skim off the mold and once again, those lighter, less dense material that's not viable seed, and the good seeds are at the bottom. So that's a good process to sort of, because they are some like growth inhibitors or that need to be broken down, and fermentation can do that. Yeah, I don't know if there's other, Allie, maybe you want to add if there's other fruits or plants that you find fermentation is important for.
Yeah, maybe not so much in Boston, but with a lot of fruits like passion fruit, like think about that jelly cucumber seeds. That's what you're looking to remove with the fermentation. So it's different plants like that have a little bit of that gel wet layer that will ferment off.
Great. Yeah, so that's a good rule of thumb. You don't need to do it with like a winter squash or something like that necessarily, but definitely, yeah, if you notice your seed, I think that's a good rule of thumb. If you notice it has that sort of like jelly on the outside, that is probably going to be a barrier for it to grow unless it ferments a bit. So the main thing you want to think about before storing your seed is that they're fully dry. Otherwise, they will rot, and not in a good way. And so small seeds can, often you can just let seeds out to dry. So Allie shared this nice picture of different varieties of seeds just drying on, what are those, sheets of paper? On the left?
Yeah, just paper towel.
Paper towels,
paper
you know,
towel.
or I often use, like, if you have screens like this, that's a really nice way just to get proper aeration. Larger seeds, you can air dry often, but you might want a fan, or you might, if you have a dehydrator, that might be a good method, but you don't want them to, you don't like bake them at 200 degrees. It should be below 100 degrees, because part of seed viability is keeping them in a cool place. So I know there are times, like, for instance, there are times that in the middle of the summer, you might have seed packets in your car, and your car is 115 degrees, probably even more so in Costa Rica, but definitely parts of our summer. And so, so you want to make sure that you're not exposing your seeds to higher temperatures than 100 degrees as much as possible, because that, you know, seeds are in some sense alive, and you know, need to take care of them and keep them in the conditions that'll keep them viable. So here's a close-up of the drying seed setup. Yeah, so storing in a cool, dry location. I mean, if you have room in your fridge, that can work. But I think, you know, if you have a place that's going to be pretty regulated temperature, and it's not going to get too hot, and is going to be dry, that's pretty good. Glass jars, plastic bags that can be sealed. And then you want to make sure it's dry. So putting a piece of dry paper can wick out moisture or be an indication if there's too much moisture. And if you have issues with insect infestations, you can put diatomaceous earth over the seeds, or freeze the seeds. Make sure to label your containers, because you will often forget. And you want to write the date, not just the variety, because seeds have a shelf life. I'll get back to that cool method in a second, Allie, but one thing to consider is seeds you can grow some seeds like 10 years later. I mean, there's always stories of growing ancient seeds or something like that, but typically their viability really drops after a couple of years, and it varies. So, you know, squash and melon seeds and lettuce seeds will last a really long time. Root seeds will last a long time, or not all roots, but radish seeds will last a long time. Whereas, for instance, onion type seeds will not. They will lose their viability quite quickly. So that's something to consider. Ali, do you want to share this really interesting seed storage method?
Yeah, so where I'm in Costa Rica is the wet tropics, so it's super hot and humid, and we don't really have fridge space to store seeds, so we use this method with cotton, where basically we put the seeds in the jar, fill the rest of the jar with cotton, and just spray a little bit of alcohol, just rubbing alcohol on the top, light that on fire, and then close the jar, and the flame will use up all the oxygen in the jar, so that once the flame goes out, the jar has a really good sealant, and it's used up all the oxygen, which improves the environment for the seeds to be able to stay dormant. For example, yesterday we had a few seeds that we took out of like this kind of darker cooler. They're still probably about like 80 degrees and somewhat humid room where we store them, to show some folks on an Instagram live event we were doing. And within an hour, the jars had some condensation on the inside, any jars that didn't have cotton in them. So it works. It's low tech, it's low cost. And if you ever find yourself in an environment a little less hospitable than the Boston area, you might want to give it a shot.
You heard it. Our area in Boston is so hospitable to cool, dry seed storage. That's a nice thing to know. But yeah, this is really cool. Thank you so much for sharing that, Allie. And if you do, you know, struggle with over humidity, it's something to consider. All right, I did this. Yeah, so I mean, I'll just quickly go over this. I want to have time for the next section, but basically peas, they're inbreeding. You typically, when you save seed, you want to collect from 10 to 20 plants. So that's just going to improve your, even if they're true to type, it's good to have diversity, of genetic diversity otherwise. Like, it's going to be true to type with the traits you want, but you also want to make sure in case one of them is a little off, you have enough to sort of cancel that out. Allow the pods to fully dry on the plants. Don't harvest your peas when they're nice and thin like you would when you eat them. And make sure they're fully dry and you have those seeds. You don't have to worry as much for cross-pollination. Tomatoes, we sort of talked about that fermentation process. Once again, it's useful to pick from multiple different plants. Dill has a lot of potential for cross-pollination, so make sure that you're time or physically or distance-wise isolating it. And then sort of that idea, it's going to go to seed. This is the flower about to go to seed. Let it dry, and then you can sort of pick off the seeds, which you might be familiar with those, either growing or for culinary purposes. Yeah, so there are more resources. Check out this website, seedalliance.org, for more information. There are many other resources as well. I hope that feels not totally intimidating and at least somewhat empowering to start seed saving and maybe doing it with a little bit more context. So yeah, I guess I will keep, Allie, do you want me to do the slides, or do you want to start sharing with your screen?
I guess I can start sharing them on my screen so you don't have to click through.
Sounds good. So if you have any questions, I can either answer them in the chat, or if you want to quickly unmute yourself now, but we're going to transition to the next section, which is maybe a little bit more fun, sharing stories, uplifting stories about seed saving experiences. All right, Allie, take it away.
Okay.
You're welcome to add questions in the chat.
I may need you to share the slides, actually.
Okay. You can just tell me to go next slide.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Yeah, so as Annabelle has already grounded us in how to share seed, a little bit more on other reasons why you might want to do it, and kind of the significance of seed saving and heirloom seeds. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about how, seeds are the basis of the food system. And I think that often we think about where our food is coming from, but not down to the level of the seed. And it's important to think about that too, right? Especially with heirloom seeds, because they've been passed down for various generations. They carry with them different cultural significant stories. And also, depending on where they've been grown out, they might be adapted to different regions, which gives them kind of a special boost in terms of viability. It's also happening within a context of global business that are controlling very control. Over 60% of the global seed annually repurchase the seeds. They don't let you.
Allie, sorry to interrupt you. You're breaking up a bit. I think it might be better if you turn your video off.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, just let me know if it's an issue again. So because of the global seed industry consolidation, there's been a 75% decrease in crop genetic diversity since the 1900s, according to the FAO. So seed saving can also kind of help us counter that statistic and save all of these important varieties. And so we're going to highlight just a few different projects that are working to do that in a minute, so that we can see the ways in which this cultural and genetic diversity is being preserved already, and things you could contribute to also by saving heirloom seed. So if we go to the next slide. A little bit more background too on the significance of heirloom seeds. Cultural significance. So different cultures will have their different food crops and different dishes that are representative of their cultures. And so saving these heirloom seeds can help preserve that kind of food culture as well. And then systems of collaborative exchange. So seed sharing and exchanging also helps to back up these reserves of saved seed, as opposed to the agribusiness that forces farmers to buy new seeds every year. If we share these among more growers, we can grow out the seed, increase it, and keep those varieties going. And then in terms of agrobiodiversity, again, that's just about preserving all of these different varieties. And then the last kind of piece of this is also about responding to climate change. So by growing out these varieties every year, they can adapt more and more to the changing climate. And that will help as well in terms of keeping them viable and keeping access to food, increasing access to food, really. So we can go to the next slide. And this is the one about climate change, but if we go to the next slide, we can start looking a little bit more into some projects that are already working on preserving heirloom varieties. So the first I wanted to highlight is this guy, John Swenson, a lawyer in Chicago. And he, one year, decided to look into a seed catalog, chose some varieties of garlic. Garlic, you have to actually separate the cloves from the bulb, and those are what you plant, each individual clove, and then you can save it and replant the next year. Basically, in the grocery store, you'll probably find two varieties of garlic, California early and California late. So he wanted to try to grow out more varieties, and so he started growing more and more from seed catalogs and got kind of this in the seed community nickname of like the garlic extraordinaire. So when the Soviet Union, which is known as the epicenter of garlic, broke up, he went and brought back as many seed varieties as he could find. So 120 different varieties from various markets and farms. He was able to bring them back to the States and grew them out. And then he listed them in the Seed Savers Exchange catalog. So our folks could exchange with him to be able to grow out these. The seed company in Iowa, and where this photo is from, is growing out all of these varieties. They have over 150 varieties of garlic. So way more than just the two in the grocery store. And then the next slide is about the seed project, a little bit more related to cultural significance. So the Hopi Heirloom Seed Initiative is in Hopi Nation around the southwest part of the country. And so due to both settler colonialism, forced relocation, and the seed agribusinesses, this Hopi corn project and corn, beans, squash, all different varieties of seeds are really important for both cultural significance and because they've been cultivated for generations to be able to thrive in the desert. So these seeds need to be able to continue to grow in that harsh condition. And it's also about community seed protection. So building community through seed saving as well. And this quote from the Hopi Foundation, I think particularly captures what it really means for them in terms of this seed initiative. So it is in our stories that blue corn, beans, and squash were the three main food crops for Hopi. Hopi developed other varieties from these three over hundreds of years through Hopi knowledge. So this is, a centuries long accumulation of knowledge held within these seeds. And so it's important both for the way that it can grow in the harsh conditions, but also for all of the cultural knowledge, the stories, and the relationships that are intertwined within these seeds. And then we have on the next slide, the Iraqi Seed Saving Project, which Annabelle and I have mentioned. That's the project that we're both working on getting started now. So in 2003, when the US invaded Iraq, the National Seed Bank was looted and destroyed. And then plus the war's impact on agriculture and on the entire landscape of the country. And then a series of orders passed by the US government that introduced agribusiness into Iraq, forcing farmers to buy, or basically gifting farmers these seeds from seed companies, so that then they would, or from like global agribusiness seed companies, so then they would be forced to keep using and repurchasing these same seeds, stuck in that cycle, and further impacting their ability to save these heirloom seeds, to be able to grow out these heirloom seeds and preserve this culture. And so both of us have Iraqi family, which is also what got us interested in this kind of seed project in particular. And so we're hoping to create a network of Iraqi growers and sharers to be able to grow out the varieties that we can find more varieties through coming together and building community, and be able to work with different seed companies potentially to be able to offer these seeds to more folks to be able to grow out, and just increase access to the seeds, to the food that's grown, and connect to other Iraqi diaspora folks throughout the US. And it's even turned into, kind of with our initial Google Forms, even turned into a bit of throughout the world. Annabelle, I don't know if you want to add any more on this.
Not much. I was thinking one thing and now I'm blanking on it. Yeah, maybe I'll think about it later, but basically, yeah, I'm gonna hold off for now. But we are looking for more varieties at some point. I think that's another idea of building community is these varieties are in commercial circulation because Aziz Naya was able to get in touch with a seed saving company here, and now several seed saving companies offer it. But we are curious about other varieties that different people might have. Oh, my cousin has been growing this variety that they brought over 10 years ago or something like that. So definitely welcoming any information people have. And I know there was like some idea of trying to be in conversation with, there is a seed bank. I think Ali found records of it in Iraq or in Kurdistan that we might want to reach out to at some point. But I think for now, just like building the community in the US feels really, really valuable. And we actually are in conversation with True Love Seeds, which if you are interested in really great emerging seed saving companies, we could list a couple others, but they're a recently opened seed saving company that very specifically focuses on seeds that have some important story behind them. And they work with, a variety of growers across the country, and they actually reached out to us. So that's a pretty exciting opportunity that we're talking about them. We're talking about with them. Yeah, that's all I'll say for now.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
I will add, sorry, one last thing is that, and
Yeah.
I'll put the link in the chat. If people are excited about growing these varieties, for Boston residents, we are selling seedlings of these 4 varieties at City Natives, and those are already available. So I will throw the link in for our seedling sale, which is now open for online pre-order. And we have one of each, whether you want to save the seeds or you just want to grow them, and then, would love to hear how they grew. So I'll share that too.
Yeah, great. And I do see some questions in the chat about bringing seeds across borders and smuggling garlic into the country. So yes, there are regulations about bringing seeds across borders. John had permission from the USDA. So that's how he was able to do that. And actually, often if the USDA grants permission, they'll take all the seeds back, but he was able to keep the varieties and grow them out himself. I guess off the record, I have taken like a few seed packets into Costa Rica from the States, but generally, yeah, you can't really send large quantities of seeds across country borders. And then the last slide, one last project I just wanted to touch on briefly is this seed rematriation project between Seed Savers Exchange and the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network. So rematriation, word similar to repatriation, but referring to that in many Indigenous cultures, seed keeping work was traditionally a woman's role. And so rematriation instead of repatriation, but essentially they're looking through the Seed Savers Exchange big catalog of exchange of seeds that folks have listed for decades. And finding seeds that have their origin, tribal origins in North America, but have been lost from a lot of those tribes. Then growing out those varieties at both Seed Savers Exchange farm and different Indigenous Seed Keepers Network farms, and rematriating those varieties back into their communities. So far, they've already identified hundreds of seeds that meet this criteria and have plans to grow them out in the future. And they have grown out and rematriated 25 varieties. So another way that seed exchanges and different communities of growers can come together to work through these that have to do with seeds. So that's all of the projects I wanted to highlight. I don't know if anyone has questions, comments, anything to add, but some of the tangible examples of ways that seed saving can work in community as well.
I'm just adding in the chat. Yeah, thank you so much, Ali. That was great. southernexposure.com. So those are 3 seed companies. I don't know, Ali, if you want to add any that I really love the work of. So Seed Savers Exchange, you mentioned a variety of times. I know you've worked with them in some capacity and they do great work. True Love is the seed company that I mentioned, is pretty new in Philly. And Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, not a great climately relevant to us, but I do know some growers who get seeds from them, and they're also a cooperative run seed saving company that has a really great history and features a lot of Southern specific varieties. And they have a lot of great information on their website. It's just like fun to look through the catalog. Yeah. This is the time if anyone has questions, you're welcome to, you can unmute yourself. One thing I will quickly add is I realized I didn't mention that before the great story you shared, Ali, about the garlic is, we often think about saving seed, but there is some actual different parts of the plants that we save for reproduction. So, cloves, bulbs and cloves. So garlic is an example of that, or flower bulbs. And then tubers, which we save for potatoes and sweet potatoes. And those are generally just genetic clones of whatever variety. You can save seed from them, which is important to do for genetic variation. But we don't tend to do that. It's a lot more labor intensive. And I think and bananas are another example of things that can be cloned. And so garlic, bananas, potatoes, all typically cloned vegetables or produce, are ones that are often more at risk of losing their variation, because it's just so easy to just, take the same one and keep using it every season. And so I think it's actually really exciting, that garlic story.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add one other thing. I think seeds are really hopeful, and I think that there's a lot of reasons we can get bogged down these days, but yeah, there's that's the statistic about crop genetic biodiversity that's being lost, but also if you grow out one tomato seed, you could get hundreds more. And so there is kind of a lot of hope in being able to save seeds, grow them out, and share them with others, and just think about the way that seed can then reproduce and reproduce and reproduce.
I saw, yeah, no, that's such a good point. And I do feel very uplifted being involved in any seed saving work. And I saw from Kate, hopefully we will have an update on the Iraqi Seed Saving Project next year. Ali definitely, and I definitely need to, there's a lot of work to do to figure out what actually we want to do, and how we actually organize it to happen. And hopefully that's inspiration. If there's any, definitely if you have any family heirloom seeds, like now is such a good time to think about how you can preserve those and share those with your community. Any questions? I know that I have to hop on to the next set of, is there a Boston community post for seed savings? Group, you mean, Annette? That's such a good question. I don't actually know of any. I know that I will say that a lot of public libraries, so the Mattapan Public Library has there's seed banks. The Eggleston Square Library, I think. Does anyone know the answer to that? A lot of people in gardening Facebook exchange seeds. Is there any explicit community in Boston around saving seeds?
Or something besides Facebook. I'm not on Facebook.
Right. Yeah, I definitely would recommend the libraries. Maybe, yeah, I guess we'll work on our writing. Well, if you know anyone who wants to ask us to write something, we'll do that.